Hi, I'm Craig Smith, a former New York Times correspondent and host of the podcast Eye on AI. I'm also a special government employee at the National Security Commission on Artificial Intelligence, and in this role, I'm serving as the host for NSCAI's podcast series on the Commission's work. At the beginning of March this year, the Commission issued its final report to the President and Congress, outlining its recommended strategy for winning in the artificial intelligence era. This week, I spoke to NSCAI staff Mike Jackson and Darren Wright about the Commission's recommendations for bringing the intelligence community up to speed with AI. They spoke about the organizational challenge and the cultural shift required to ensure that the intelligence community is integrating AI into its work. I hope you find the conversation as informative as I did. Mike and then Darren, could you each introduce yourselves? And then I have some questions about how AI will benefit the intelligence communities.
Yes, thank you. My name is Lieutenant Colonel Mike Jackson. I'm active duty Army officer who's been detailed to support the National Security Commission on AI for the last 2 years, where I've been taking a close look at what DoD and what the intelligence community can do to help adopt and integrate AI more thoroughly into its operations.
And Darren?
Hi, my name is Darren Wright. I am an S&T researcher for the Department of Defense. I was fortunate enough to be requested for a detail starting last fall and have been associated with NSCAI to support them as they've researched and reported on current state of artificial intelligence and what's needed from a national perspective in order to get us going.
And the chapter we're talking about in the National Security Commission on AI's final report is Chapter 5, AI and the Future of National Intelligence. Can you answer in turn why you make the assertion that AI will benefit national intelligence more than any other national security mission?
More than any other aspect of national security, intelligence depends on the ability to make sense of huge amounts of disparate data in order to inform decision makers. So the core elements of creating an intelligence report, organizing large amounts of data, sifting out the chaff, sorting through the data in an efficient and effective manner, and then creating actionable or predictive knowledge by finding previously unknown links or anomalies is exactly what AI is good at.
Intelligence will also benefit from the entire AI stack from start to finish. And if the U.S. doesn't capitalize on all that AI has to offer when it comes to augmenting the work of highly trained analysts, not only do analysts who work at the ground level lose out, but ultimately it's our policymakers who are affected. Because we are getting to the point in time where the volume and veracity of information is overwhelming human cognition, and AI certainly can help with that.
Can you give me a sense of the breakdown of formats in which that information is coming into the ICs? Is it primarily text? Is it primarily audio? Is it primarily imagery? Or is it equal between the three?
It depends on the mission of a unit and the analysts or researchers, what they're looking at. But really, everything you just mentioned, pretty much equally, eventually it averages out to be more or less the same. So large amounts of disparate data. And that makes it even more difficult when you aren't using AI, when you have analysts with very specialized skills. They're often focused on one or two types of information, whereas AI being able to fuse the data so that it can be usable, that's going to make it a lot easier for analysts to be able to leverage all types of information even easier.
What's your assessment of where the IC is now, or the ICs are now, and where are the gaps?
What we found is that the IC is ahead of the rest of the U.S. government in many ways. And we actually go into more detail on that on a separate podcast with you on setting the technical foundations for AI. The IC was certainly a first mover for cloud computing. Its first commercial cloud services contract, C2S, went live in 2014, so that's 7 years ago. But we still don't believe the IC is ready to integrate AI-enabled tools ubiquitously through all the stages of intelligence and across the intelligence domain. From a technical perspective, that's why we recommend they continue to build out their IC information technology environment. They call it iSight, with a focus on the technical foundation that Chapter 2 of our report outlines in much more detail. But more than that, conceptually, we recommend that starting immediately, the IC should prioritize automating each stage of the intelligence cycle to the greatest extent possible and processing all available data and information through AI-enabled analytical systems before human analyst review. There's just so much potential for automation in planning and tasking and collection and exploitation and analysis and dissemination. And to your point earlier on what types of information, we stress that products should be disseminated at machine speeds, which means they must be in machine readable formats so that systems across the IC can ingest them and use them without manual intervention. So it really is irrelevant if it came in as overhead imagery or text or some type of signals collection. Products need to be made machine readable and disseminated at that speed. And we really think that optimizing AI-enabled systems in this way will require an entirely different approach to the creation and review of finished products.
Making all of these different types of data fully available to all analysts is a huge benefit. But I also want to stress that AI isn't a way to enable analysts to be lazy. They're still going to need to be highly trained. And a lot of this is going to have to do with the culture. There's going to have to be a shift so that analysts understand when AI is and isn't appropriate for use within the analytic process. We refer to it as a human-centric AI, so that the AI is required for doing the processing and analysis at machine speed, while the analysts have to fully understand how to make use of the AI.
You indicated, Darren, that it's really driven by the application of AI and AI products is driven by teams and their particular needs. The information coming into the ICs comes through various gateways. Is there talk about applying AI systems at those gateways to screen things as they're coming in because of the enormous volume and flagging things that need to be looked at, or is that already done? That's one question. The other is, Mike, you talked about the need to make data machine readable. And I've talked to people before about overhead imagery, and the ICs still annotate that data with very sophisticated light boxes, but the results are not machine readable. And is there a project that you have recommended or that's underway to bring annotation platforms into the ICs so that all of the annotated data that they produce is machine readable?
A big part of AI is the ability to develop models, train the models so that they are more and more capable of knowing what to look for. And then once it's trained to a certain extent, the model is able to pull in the information that's most needed and to process it appropriately. So certainly AI will be crucial as more data is collected, especially with the Internet of Things, social media. Everybody's using the internet now, but as more and more devices are used that are connected to the internet, there's just going to be a huge increase in the amount of data flowing in. So certainly AI will help with processing that in order to sift through and then pull in ultimately to the end user the types of data that are needed.
Just as an example, the Army has a project called Convergence. And in, I believe it was September of 2020, they did their first live fire test of the system. It involved AI at a couple of places along the engagement process. And the first was to ingest overhead imagery and to process that imagery to look for targets using computer vision. And then once it identified targets, it put it to a different AI system that orchestrated the best possible platform to engage in and kicked out courses of action to act on as a commander. They did it successfully. They test fired long-range cannon artillery at, I believe, 60 kilometers and struck the target. And the general officer running the program said basically that process was a 20-minute process before they introduced AI throughout the engagement cycle. They condensed down to 20 seconds. There are other similar types programs for more national security specific analysis, but all the ones that those we saw were classified environments. And I don't think we can really get into.
Yeah. And then on making data machine readable, has there been much done on that?
There's a bunch of different types of algorithms for doing natural language processing. So it does make the text readable and it cleans up the text and puts it into a structure that can be used. Then it's able to find connections once the texts are set up so that it can be processed. Once the text is structured so that it can be processed, it's just going through tons of information and finding those anomalies or finding those linkages that a human normally would not be able to do.
And what about overhead imagery where, as I said, the ICs are using light tables?
I have seen some projects to automate what you're talking about. And I guess there's two sides of it. One is having standard data formats and ontologies. And as you bring them in to make sure they're right, the other part is producing your final finished product in a machine readable format, which means it's not PDF, it's not tables or graphs, it's the underlying data. So there's work being done in all these cases. I think the major recommendation from our commission was you've got to accelerate it, and it can't be an afterthought. It has to be baked in from the beginning that machine readable matters on ingestion, for analysis, and on dissemination.
Would that depend on private sector platforms on bringing those into the ICs, or does the commission advocate building platforms internally?
I would say that the commission took a more balanced approach, that it's going to be both. I mean, many of our commissioners recognize that the Defense Department and the IC are going to be reliant on private industry for innovations. But we also make the point that there are probably some capabilities that need to be built in-house. We can't buy it all. So it's kind of this, what do you build, what do you buy, and what do you rent sometimes in terms of capabilities. And it'd be very specific to the application.
Generally, when people think of artificial intelligence, they think of supercomputers processing millions, even billions of documents or images or whatever. But I still do projects at home where I use my laptop to develop deep neural networks that I then run. And there's a lot of analysts within the IC that don't have the ability to get access to either an environment or the necessary tools used to develop ad hoc capabilities. So one of the quickest ways for the IC to start integrating AI is going to be having mid-level and lower-level management support the analyst to get access so that we can leverage our knowledge that we've spent time gaining and to be able to develop and use AI on the fly on a daily basis.
Yeah, it seems that there are two levels. One would be at a very high level, screening and flagging things for analysts to look at, but then at the individual analyst level, having tools to analyze the data that they're looking at. And do the commission's recommendations address both those levels?
Yes, I would say certainly. We, from the beginning, have taken the approach of top-down leadership and bottom-up innovation. And to Darren's point, you can't direct all of these things from the top and get it right. The top needs to set conditions that allow individual analysts to be creative, to have the environments they need, have the infrastructure they need, to have access to compute, access to data policies for sharing, all of that stuff. So both are required, and neither is sufficient on its own.
The final report does an excellent job of really making detailed critical recommendations for empowering the individual analyst. So designating a chief technology officer to drive continual AI adoption, also allowing the individual centers or units better ability to be able to balance technical risks involved in bringing new technologies online, and also keeping them updated, balancing that with the substantial operational risks that could result from not keeping pace. and then also gaining support from intelligence committees in Congress in order to provide the individual organizations with the flexible use of funds within a more agile software development framework.
Can you speak more about the need to empower science and technology leadership within the ODNI and how that will help the broader intelligence community?
We believe that the type of change we're talking about will require leadership at multiple levels. One of our highest priority recommendations is to establish a steering committee on emerging technology as a partnership between the Department of Defense and the intelligence community. We envision it being co-chaired by the Deputy Secretary of Defense, the Vice Chairman for the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Deputy Director of National Intelligence. We think that's just crucial to align strategy priorities between the DoD and the IC. We also propose that the Director of Science and Technology within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence is designated as the Chief Technology Officer with additional authorities to establish technical and policy standards across the IC. And one very important responsibility we recommend giving to the new CTO is managing the development and implementation of a technology annex to the National Intelligence Strategy. We see this as a counterpart to a very similar technology annex we recommended for the Defense Department to develop around the National Defense Strategy. And we see this as a critical tool to establish technology roadmaps so that we can adapt artificial intelligence-enabled applications and solve the true operational intelligence requirements outlined in the National Intelligence Strategy. Lastly, I'll say our commission did highlight the need to change the IC's approach from pure risk aversion to risk management. Its current risk management framework does a great job of identifying technical risks, which is completely necessary. But we believe the IC also needs mechanisms to weigh the cost of not adopting the emerging technologies. So we recommend ODNI create a risk management council led by the CTO, the CIO, and the CDO, and with senior reps from each intelligence agency and service branch. And they would feed into that steering committee on emerging technology and help the IC weigh the risks of not adopting as equally to the technical risks of adopting.
On the IC CTO, I was surprised to hear that they don't have a CTO. How has that been handled to date? Is there a coordinating body? And how would that CTO interact with the DoD's CTO? Would that be through this TriChair committee that has also been recommended?
There's only actually, I believe, 3 positions within the Office of the Director of National Intelligence actually codified in law: the Director, the Principal Deputy Director, and the Director of Science and Technology. The Director of Science and Technology, in many ways, when you look at their statutory requirements or responsibilities, looks a lot like DoD's equivalent, the Undersecretary of Defense for Research and Engineering, but lack certain authorities that we recommended, and it doesn't say anywhere in law, doesn't designate him as CTO. So the position is kind of there. We just said, you've got to codify this, you've got to write it into law, designate the CTO, grant these additional authorities that will help him or her do their job. And yes, USDRNU would be the counterpart, and we think there'd be multiple mechanisms for them to work together.
I'm actually glad to hear that you were surprised that we don't have a CTO. And that was a big point of the commission. We need to get our organizational structure in place and also make the culture shift to start integrating more quickly.
Going back, Mike, to what you said about the Annex, can you explain what an Annex is exactly for people who aren't familiar with the nomenclature?
Yeah, of course. So every year, the Department of Defense writes and publishes a national defense strategy, and the intelligence community writes a national intelligence strategy. They have both classified and unclassified versions. So you could download the unclassified national strategy and read through it. It has a classified counterpart, and the classified counterpart actually outlines the key operational challenges to maintain competitiveness. We are saying take those and the equivalent with the national intelligence strategy and actually build technology roadmaps that go from investments to research and development, to building or buying, to integrating into exercises and prototypes, and eventually to fielding for the most important technologies to get at the capabilities needed to solve those operational challenges. And that document will be a living document that's reviewed by the TriChair Steering Committee on Emerging Technology so that DoD and the IC can make trade-off decisions and shift investments to critical technologies that will actually help solve these operational challenges.
You've mentioned changing the culture a few times at the ICs. Is this more of a cultural challenge or a funding challenge to get the ICs up to speed on using AI?
All of the above. Culturally, Mike touched on this already. I did a little bit too with the risk aversion. That's one key thing that has to change. It's always a risk when you include new technologies into existing systems that you're comfortable with. But do you want to risk not having the information in a quick manner so that we can inform policymakers when they need to be informed? The other thing is change within the IC and DoD in general is a constant. We have military leadership that is around 2 to 3 years and has to go on rotations. And even with the NSCAI, they've got the vision, but now when they move on, we need to make sure that that vision is executed. And that requires management, senior executive services, down all the way to lower level management. Generally, we have a very narrow view of what needs to be done for reasons of mission set, but we have to start looking at return on investment and think about what's going to happen if we just keep doing the same thing we always do and not start focusing on enacting that vision so that we can be set for the future as well as the near term.
What I would like is a few specific examples of what we're talking about. That's frankly more interesting if we can bring it down to a use case. Can either of you describe the current way a particular function is carried out, the technology that's used, and how AI might improve that function?
I'll share an example. When we went to a few of the intelligence communities and they took us through the process, and we heard from a lot of analysts, basically visualized it going into their office. It's a classified environment, so they don't have cell phones or they don't have a computer they can get on in Google, but they sit down at their workstation, they open up their workload for the day and take the example like looking for missile sites or whatever in China or North Korea, and they just start going through all of these pictures, whether full motion video or satellite or whatever it is, a collection asset. And the first 4 to 6 hours of their day may literally just be looking at picture after picture after picture, where if they look through, say, 1,000 pictures, 7 of them had actionable intelligence. They can't even get to the point where they're making sense of those 7 until they've gone through all of them. So they might be on hour 6 or 8 by the time they're turning their attention from purely looking at pictures to see if there's something of value to trying to take what they see in the pictures and figure out the actual intelligence value of that and make it into a usable product. What we're saying is computer vision can outperform human vision in many ways, and that's been proven since like 2015. A system should have looked at every incoming picture and flagged those top 5. So as soon as the analyst sits down, they can start the actual analysis work and take that burden of just repetitively looking at pictures to see if it looks important off of their table.
Not many humans are good at sitting down for 8 hours to pick out all of the important things from a video.
In order for these systems to work, someone has to annotate all of that data. And while there are machine-assisted labeling systems, to get them going, you need expert annotators. And then even after they're labeled automatically, you need an annotator to check or correct all of the imagery or whatever the data format is.
On commercial applications, there are many, many organizations doing this. And quite honestly, when you talk to big business or hedge funds or investment companies, they're all doing this. It kind of gets to your question earlier about is it technology or budget or culture? When we talk to most in the intelligence community, one individual, and they shared that they had this problem they wanted to help solve. It took them, I want to say 6 months to get approval to release the unclassified data set to a vendor. the technology never seems to be the hard part, but there's so many hurdles from data sharing, data access, authority to operate on networks when you try to introduce it into an existing network that takes so much time and so much energy that we're missing out on advances that are widely available and should be integrated quickly.
That's why I was talking about platforms, because there are platforms available that you can install on-premise or in the cloud, in the secure cloud, and then annotate without having to turn it over to a service company externally. Is that one of the things that the TriChair committee would address, that kind of siloing and barriers to get access to data?
It certainly could. And the TriChair Steering Committee on Emerging Technology was somewhat modeled after what was called the Advanced Capabilities and Deterrence Panel, a similar structure from like 2014 to 2016. And it was co-chaired by Bob Work as the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Admiral retired Winnefeld as the Vice Chairman, and Ms. O'Sullivan as the Principal Deputy Director for D&I. And just as an example, they helped manage the introduction and creation of Project Maven. And the Deputy Secretary of Defense, Bob Work, had to personally sign off to get Project Maven the full motion video they needed to train their models. They just couldn't get it done. It had to go to that level. So we do think that that would be a role for that steering committee reimagined.
How long do you guys think it will take to get these things implemented, and how hopeful are you that the Commission's recommendations in this arena will be accepted?
I think the nation as a whole realizes that we really need to get a move on before we have to start catching up with other countries with AI. As long as the nation as a whole continues to move forward, not just for national security, but for the economy and other important reasons why we need to integrate AI, I think we'll keep moving forward. And AI is just like electricity. It's going to permeate, or already does permeate, so much. Every sector of the economy, every aspect of our jobs within the DoD and beyond. It all comes down to, though, our ability to persist and maintain consistency in following our leaders. And hopefully the leaders will find avenues for flexible funding for lower level organizations that are somewhat resource constricted to have funds. And it doesn't always take a ton of funding. The really big platforms like you're talking about, hosted in the cloud, that are accessible by everybody, that can be done at the center level. But it's sometimes the day-to-day things that we need to develop ad hoc capabilities for. That's what we really need flexible funds for, and a vision from lower level leaders and mid-level management to really push that, to make that change so that we're integrating these tools every day.
Provided that all recommendations are accepted, is this something that's going to take a year, 5 years, 10 years to implement?
We actually have different timelines associated with some of the different recommendations. Some will take longer, some will take shorter. We make the grand challenge for both the Department of Defense and the IC to be what we describe as AI ready by 2025. And that means they have the infrastructure and the policies and the tools in place so AI can be more ubiquitously deployed throughout the systems. But as you can imagine, there is a lot of expense, a lot of resources, and a lot of work to actually get there. So we tried to give what we thought could be done in a year, what we thought would take longer, and we tried to establish the governance mechanisms to drive that change. And we also make a specific recommendation that they develop metrics for their AI readiness and track that themselves as well, because that kind of doesn't exist yet.
Tagging data for AI is one of the most manually taxing aspects of it. And actually, in the past, not so much now, but contractors would be contracted out to manually tag the data to help build models. So it wasted time and resources. Now there are some amazing algorithms that once you build a model, use dictionaries. It could be a huge list of organizations or people. Then you can use that to run a ton of text through, and anytime something within that dictionary is matched, then it'll tag it appropriately. So that's something that's just amazing, a huge time saver. Another thing most people are interested in is GANs, generative adversarial networks. As we're doing analysis and research, it's going to be more and more difficult to figure out what's real and what's not. And this is a big concern way beyond intelligence. So AI is interesting because it's not just a capability we need to pour a bunch of information in and develop. It is a constellation of technologies that we're always going to have to be developing as other countries or other actors with less than good intentions use things like deep fakes to affect society and even go after individuals. We're going to need ways of figuring out what's real and what's fake. So again, it's that vision. We need consistency to continue to develop and bring in AI capabilities.
Did you guys look closely at what China was doing, or as much as you can, how its intelligence community is using AI? And do you think they're ahead of the U.S. or that the U.S. retains a lead?
We have a classified version of our report, and it's where a lot of the intelligence community analysis and findings reside. What our commissioners have said publicly is U.S. still has a lead in many cases, but that lead is shrinking. And if we don't take these bold steps that we've recommended for the intelligence community, DoD, the rest of the government, it is very possible that we lose the lead within the next decade.
That's it for this week's podcast. I want to thank Mike and Darren for their time. I encourage everyone who cares about the future of our world to read the National Security Commission on AI report, which can be found at www.nscai.gov. Regardless of how you feel about military uses of AI, I believe it's critical that people involved in the field understand what the government is doing. The singularity may not be near, but AI is changing your world, so pay attention.